I'm a psychologist who loves technology, and I know there are a lot of psychologists who don't feel very comfortable with technology. Since the goal of this channel is accessibility, I thought it would be helpful to do an AI primer or an AI 101 to help folks have a solid foundation from which to tackle the larger ethical and practical questions we're all facing across our individual specialties. So I'm really excited to talk to you today and show you some things about AI that are designed to be very beginner-friendly and practical. If you're already familiar with AI, this probably isn't the video for you, though you're of course welcome to stick around. As psychologists, we're also big on positionality, so for context, my position on AI is one of cautious optimism. I think these tools have incredible potential and also significant danger. Some of that potential is for things I'm really passionate about, like helping make reports more accessible and reader-friendly. But that optimism is tempered with the sobering positions on risks and limitations and ethical considerations, which is particularly true in the forensic space where I work. All you have to do is look left and right to find folks blasting ahead with reckless abandon, to those who don't want to engage for fear of contributing to a doomsday dystopia. As you are evaluating how I'm coming to you today, just know that I consider myself an AI moderate. I'm definitely pro using it to support our work, but I also really invite restraint and deep, thoughtful conversations about its use. As is typical, I'm going to just remind you that this isn't legal, clinical, or IT advice. I'm just a psychologist sharing what I've learned from hundreds of hours of research in AI use. I'm trying to keep this to a more neutral framework that primarily addresses basics, so please take what's helpful and then do your own research, experimentation, and development. One other thing I'm going to do is practice the kind of transparency that the APA has recommended that practitioners utilize with AI. So I'm going to tell you about any substantive use of AI for this video. I drafted an outline myself that I then uploaded and asked AI to improve its organization and fact check for accuracy, and also to list anything that I missed. I used those suggestions for further edits on my own. I also used AI to adjust some of the grammar, especially in the definitions, for optimal clarity and length and to make them as beginner-friendly as possible. I assume full agency for everything that follows. All right, let's start from the beginning. What is AI? The concept of AI is not at all new. Its origins are thought to date back to 1956 and an event known as the Dartmouth Conference, where several industry leaders came together and formalized AI as a distinct discipline. They mapped out a mission for the field and some potential research paths, many of which are still relevant today. AI is the science and practice of developing machines that simulate human intelligence, reasoning, and communication. And I'm going to encourage you to never forget that word simulate, that it simulates cognition rather than thinking on its own, especially coming from the perspective of a field focused on human cognition. Because AI truly doesn't reason like a human being, but it does simulate reasoning in ways that have potential utility for improving human reasoning. It's a sophisticated mimicry, but not a sentient mind. Not all AI is the same, so I'm going to walk you through a curated history here, and I'm going to talk about things using levels. Level 1 would be rule-based AI. This is the oldest and simplest form of AI, and it's being used every day. These are systems that follow simple instructions that are often structured with if-then programming. If one thing happens, then it triggers another thing happening. There isn't any learning, it's just repetition and executing pre-programmed commands. These are things that you're already familiar with, like smart devices that have rules to make decisions semi-autonomously or without a human explicitly telling it. So these are your irrigation systems that know when it rains and suppresses the sprinklers, or your thermostat that learns your schedule and turns the heat down when you're gone. or a simple chatbot that gives fixed responses, and so it can really only address simple, predictable inquiries. Level 2 would be machine learning, which was the next big leap and a huge building block for where we are today. So instead of being given explicit rules, these systems are designed to learn directly from data. They use algorithms. An algorithm is a step-by-step set of instructions for a computer to follow. It's like a precise computational recipe and statistical model to first identify patterns and then to make predictions or ultimately decisions that are based on what they detected. So with machine learning, AI can use a collection of algorithms that help it learn and adapt. So while historically computer instructions had fixed rules, with machine learning, AI algorithms can be dynamic, meaning that they are programmed to change and improve over time. By incorporating new information and learning to handle things, the programmers may not have explicitly predicted and then told it what to do next. So, machine learning algorithms are critical to helping AI meet its goals. Another way of thinking about this is that algorithms are the step-by-step processes that enable pattern recognition so that machines can detect trends or characteristics within data. This concept of pattern recognition is critical to understanding AI, particularly when we get to the next step. The easiest examples of machine learning are Facebook targeted ads that get increasingly better based on your click history, or when Netflix suggests the next show you want to watch. So, as psychologists, we're constantly emphasizing that correlation is not causation, and that's really where it's important to have a good understanding of the limits of machine learning. While it's great at detecting correlation, it fundamentally can't understand causation. This ends up being some of the reason you see it misunderstand things, which at best leads to zany stories about its mistakes, but at worst leads to really serious concerns about replication of bias. For us, working with people, one of our core missions is often to try and understand why something happens, not just that it happens together or in a pattern. And that's just a level of nuance that's often not reachable with AI, at least not right now. Level 3 is called generative AI, and this is the buzz that you're hearing about, unless you've been living under a rock the last couple of years. You've been hearing about things like ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini or Copilot. So these are tools that use generative AI. Now, generative AI is a type of machine learning that doesn't just recognize patterns, but then uses them to generate additional material. And it can do that best with words, but it can also do it and is getting increasingly good at doing it with images, code, audio, and video, and even numerical calculations. So generative AI is what we're going to be focusing on for the rest of this video because it has profound and immediate implications for our work as psychologists. How does generative AI work? This comes down to something called a large language model, or LLM. LLMs were created by basically feeding into a big model like this vast digital brain, a massive library with most of the internet, books, articles, transcripts, trying to get a colossal snapshot of human knowledge and culture. The LLM processes all this information and learns patterns and relationships by breaking down language into fundamental pieces for sorting into hierarchical parts, which it can then assign weights to based on relevance, relationships, and patterns. It's like a very complex web of information. And so then when a user asks a question, which we call a prompt, it can reproduce, reorder, and reassign those parts and put all this back together to become a highly sophisticated prediction engine. It's constantly guessing the next most probable word or phrase or best fit response to the prompt. Now, again, even though this process can feel very real, we have to remember that it doesn't understand concepts like a human does. Another thing to keep in mind is that even though AI can feel quite all-knowing at times, it does best still with language-based tasks. And generally speaking, less well with certain kinds of analytical, numerical, or theoretical slash existential type tasks, unless those things can be well enough represented verbally and there was enough of a training base to draw on context that can leverage the way the LLM works. Interactions with LLMs start with prompts, which is just an instruction or your conversation starter. Let's say you tell it, summarize this article. It analyzes the words in the article and then calculates the most probable sequence of words to generate a response that fulfills your request. Usually, its idea of best is fastest. So that's important because in psychology, our definition of best is often the opposite of fastest. We value nuance and critical thinking and careful consideration. So this potential conflict is something that sometimes we're countering when we're interacting or prompting the LLM. And then again, of course, when we're evaluating the output, which we'll get into. Another thing to know about LLMs is that people talk about LLM versions. So you might have ChatGPT 4 or 5, you might have Gemini 2.5 Pro or 1.5 Flash. Each model is a little different from each other and has different strengths and weaknesses. So just like we name our tests and the different generations of those tests, clarifying the LLM version that was used is a way of communicating about the programming and the training behind the model that as it was constructed. This is most analogous to the question, did you use the MMPI-2 RF or the MMPI-3? But it's not strictly that later versions are inherently better or that earlier versions are inherently outdated. Depending on your goals, you might choose different models for different things. So if you want the fastest answers, you might choose one model. And if you want the one that works best with certain types of reasoning tasks, you might choose another. A huge factor when we talk about data privacy, and we'll get to that, is that certain models are only offered in conjunction with certain HIPAA-compliant tools, and so you might be limited that way too. Now, choosing a specific model is usually a level of granularity that psychologists don't really need to worry about, but if you do forensic work, you should at least be prepared to say which model you used if you ended up using AI in some substantive way for your evaluation. How is AI different from a search engine? One way that it's helpful to understand what it means to be generative is to compare this to something that we know. So let's take a traditional Google search and compare it to an LLM query. Google or other search engines find things that already exist, and an LLM creates new things. So let's just break that down more using an analogy, okay? So in a search engine, you ask a question, and if it can find it, it gives you a list of existing web pages or documents or images or videos related to your inquiry. If you think of it like a librarian, you can send it out into the library and it comes back with existing things it can find for you. So it's a retrieval system. An LLM differs from that in that it creates things. In keeping with our analogy here, it's more like a super fast ghostwriter, but one that can run around the library really fast to fill in holes with librarian retrieval that it then incorporates immediately into its ghostwriting. So even if you ask it a Google type question, it's going to generate an actual answer for you while hopefully also linking you to some of those same pages that Google does. So you can ask AI to summarize an article, and it does more than just reproduce the abstract. It will also generate a new paragraph summarizing that article. You can ask it for an analogy to explain a complex topic, and it writes one for you rather than going to actually find one that already exactly exists online. It's also then more flexible with what it can do related to an inquiry since it's generating new material. For example, it can either summarize an article or sets of articles, or it can create a podcast for you where two fictional people discuss the article to help you learn and remember it. I find it helpful for psychological tasks to think about these two systems in the context of constraints. If Google finds things, it's limited by what it can find. If you ask it for something that doesn't exist, then it can't find it. But it also sometimes doesn't find things that do exist. So in our work, the outcome of that might mean that we search Google Scholar and miss some articles for our lit review without us realizing. Keeping with this idea of constraints, if LLMs create things, it's limited by the material in its training pool. So LLMs can't create anything truly novel, like a groundbreaking discovery that's never been thought of before. It's best to think of it like a very powerful tool to remix or synthesize material. But ultimately, it's regurgitating and reconfiguring information it's already encountered in its training. Sometimes when creating things, humans get them wrong. So the LLM has a version of that too, which is that they'll sometimes, maybe even often, fill in gaps by making up something that sounds plausible. If you ask for 10 articles but it only finds 8, it might simulate the other 2 and slip them onto the list without telling you because that's the pattern it predicts should be there. In our work, this might mean that we come to believe an article or case law exists when it doesn't. And so that brings us to a very important topic, which is, what is an AI hallucination? Not only can AI make mistakes because it doesn't understand context or nuance, but it can deliberately insert false information. Because LLMs work on prediction based on pattern recognition, AIs can do something called hallucinating, where they insert what they believe should be the next step in the pattern. So then a hallucination is when AI confidently states incorrect information to invent facts, most often to fill in gaps. Because they lack human understanding of nuance, they can also miss crucial data points that a trained clinician would likely catch. And they can reinforce problematic ideas in either subtle or dramatic ways, such as reinforcing certain kinds of bias that were present in their massive training data sets. This isn't just an error that can be programmed out. I mean, there are some things that can correct it at the prompt level or at the level of precision in its outputs that are set, or sometimes also with source citations. But I really try and go in assuming that even with those strategies, hallucination rates will never drop to zero. Just like when you're working with a student, you can never just assume you can skip review of the material that they generate. And so, with that kind of expectation, the burden then shifts to the human as far as agency, and that means the requirement for fact checking is very intense. Understanding hallucination rates is not the only point of inaccuracy for AI, but there's a lot to be vigilant about in this regard for both clinical and forensic settings. All right, so that was a lot. Let's summarize. First, what is an LLM? It's an engine trained on a massive library of data that recognizes patterns and predicts the next word. Or in other words, it simulates human communication and creation. What is a prompt? A prompt is an interaction with an LLM, so it's the way you converse. What is a version? A version is which generation of LLM you used. So this is kind of analogous to what test you used and what number of test it was, what version. How is it different than a search engine? Well, search engines find things that exist and link you to them, and AI creates things by modifying things that exist and putting them together in new ways. So this was our analogy of a librarian versus a ghostwriter. And then lastly, what is a hallucination? A hallucination is when AI states incorrect information or invents facts, often to fill in gaps. Okay, now that we have a better understanding of some of this factual framework, let's talk about some of the more applied fundamentals as far as how to use AI responsibly. This is a section of this video that's likely to become obsolete as AI continues to develop, so I'm going to try to keep this as high level as possible and mostly try to avoid naming specific tools where possible. So first, let's make a distinction here. We talked about what an LLM is, but we didn't talk yet about the fact that there is this very fundamental distinction for those using LLMs in healthcare applications, or really anyone who's using them with sensitive or personal data. Okay, so first, there are open or public LLMs. This is just an interface that makes interaction with the LLM available to anyone. So what happens with these is that anything that's put into them can then be swirled back into their massive data set in future models or in the current model to help continue to train and refine them. So obviously that's of concern for private or confidential information. And with open public models, we're going to want to use a very high degree of caution for confidentiality and not put anything in there that we wouldn't also post on Facebook. Basically, anything that you would need a release for, you cannot go into these. So anything with identifying details are off limits. And remember that these LLMs are very smart, so you have to keep that in mind even when you're de-identifying data to put in there. They recognize patterns at an incredibly high level. And so they can often put things together that you might not expect. So you want to be conservative about that. All right, so that kind of information makes up the bulk of what we're interacting with in healthcare or psychology or the social sciences. So because of that, there are also secure or compliant that you can put PHI into because the system is designed to protect sensitive information the same way that other electronic systems would, right? So like an electronic healthcare chart. It's closed. They don't release the charting information into Google. And so these kinds of programs interact with LLMs in ways that are similarly closed. And they don't let data out of the system the same way that open models do. So make sure that you understand, like we just talked about, how to assess privacy and read your user agreements to see what happens with your data. And we'll talk in a little bit about other privacy and confidentiality concerns. But the point here is that typically what you have with healthcare or other platforms that interact with sensitive data is a system that does these things here. Encrypts data and doesn't train with data and deletes data. And generally those systems are still typically using the same LLMs that you get with open systems. They just have third-party agreements with these major LLMs to protect data differently. So maybe you're interacting with ChatGPT-4 whether you're open or closed, but with a closed system you have these protections when your data goes to the LLM. Now, on top of this, there are also LLMs that get specialized training for more niched functions. For example, Google has fed a model tons of healthcare-specific information so that it has more context for medical language and diagnosis, and then you may get the benefit of choosing to interact with that LLM within your HIPAA-compliant platform. But you still need the wrapper of your HIPAA-compliant platform in order to send PHI to that LLM, whereas if you just opened a chat in a window of that LLM's public interface, you would be breaching privacy. Hopefully this distinction makes sense, and we'll address it more when we get to how to assess for compliant platforms. Okay, there are also progress note tools. These operate on two levels. First, transcribing the session, and then second, generating a session note from that transcript. If you want a deeper dive on these, check out the training I've linked to in the description on writing defensible progress notes in clinical settings. Okay, there's chatbots. These use agents or workflows to simulate human interaction. These are kind of like automated processes, automated interactions with LLMs. So they can have humans in the loop, but often they don't. So with these, there are administrative chatbots that can help with scheduling or accepting referrals or responding to emails. And they're getting more and more agentic, which means that they're starting to operate more and more autonomously in administrative functions. But then there's also clinical chatbots, which replicate or try to mimic therapy or behavioral level support. Okay, the next one is research tools. They'll often pair a search engine with an LLM, but other times it's that they'll pull and analyze the articles directly for you. But the idea is that they can help corral the LLM into a more restrained and narrow function. These can be very helpful with literature reviews or various kinds of hypothesis testing, but just like every single tool, You always want to make sure that you're following behind to read the study or review the case or sources that it pointed you to. There are also image or video generators, and I'm mentioning these mainly because people are doing some great things with these in the areas of increasing accessibility and making psychological content more approachable. Lastly, there are learning tools. So if you're, say, studying for board certification or trying to develop competencies in a new subspecialty, you can put your training materials or cases or books, if you have electronic versions of them, into this, and it will create flashcards, quizzes, summaries, or even podcasts to help you better learn the material. If you're using free versions, you need to make sure you have permissions to put material in there, or else you want it to be a closed model and ensure that none of the material goes back for model training so that you're not violating copyright or intellectual property rules. A HIPAA-compliant system using AI should have a few things in common, and there are 4 basic things that I teach clinicians to evaluate when assessing whether a new tool is HIPAA-compliant. So number 1, will they sign a BAA? And the answer to this must be yes. Number 2, do they use or allow others to use your data to train their models? And the answer to this must be no. Number 3, do they use proper encryption? So this one can get a little murky, but you want to hear something along the lines that data should be encrypted in transit and at rest. And then 4, is there a mechanism and a process for secure deletion? So again, this can get a little murky, but really what you should be listening for is that there is a clearly articulated explanation that also incorporates secure deletion with your account closure. If you have these 4 things in place, you can be reasonably assured that you can put PHI into a given tool or system without a HIPAA violation. But I have to emphasize that HIPAA is sort of the lowest minimal threshold. So it's kind of like how our ethics code is the ethical floor and not the ceiling. Translated here, that means that there are considerations around privacy that also involve careful thinking about what you're doing with people's data and whether or not you need to tell them about it. So just because something is HIPAA compliant doesn't absolve us from very important ethical decisions about informed consent, disclosing use in a report, and then other things like contracts or permissions to move data or put data into a certain platform. This is the idea that an input goes into this dark and confusing AI architecture and then comes out with an output that we can't track backward to understand exactly how it got from A to B. It's an important thing to remember in regulating how we're using AI and when we're using AI. So there are lots of psychological applications where the black box problem isn't particularly worrisome because the level of human oversight largely mitigates the issue. For example, if you ask AI to summarize a record that you've already read, and then it does summarize that record so that you have a better understanding of it and to give you a jumping off point for your report, as long as that actual record exists and you've reviewed it with your own eyes, then ultimately, if the summary gets something wrong, it can be fact checked. And if you get something wrong in your combined work with that AI summary, you can be fact checked. With this example, it doesn't really matter that we can't see the exact process between input and output because we have the capacity to check the legitimacy and accuracy of the output against the source. Your expertise as the clinician is the final check, and you can also explain why that's the right answer, referencing the training and experience of the average psychologist. Same thing if you ask it to write you a reader-friendly version of a test description, assuming that you have training and experience with that test so that the output you get will be weighed against your judgment and experience. Then you'll edit it further so that it reflects your voice, but ultimately that accuracy, you have agency around that. Plus, there's a manual where your description could be compared for further fact-checking. The process that it used to come up with that initial verbiage, like what happened inside from A to B, even if we don't understand it, it really doesn't have any substantive bearing on the outcome. Now, as we get closer to higher risk AI uses, the black box problem expands. So, at least where we're at right now, I try to never put it in positions where it's going to have to analyze complex patterns and then give me an output where I wouldn't be able to observe this same level of accountability between input and output. So, an example of high risk use might be feeding in a bunch of complex risk factors, which all have different levels of weighting in their relevance or presentation, and then asking it to spit out a summary risk rating as a result. I wouldn't do that with where the tech is at today because I couldn't explain to the trier of fact exactly how that input of those factors related to that output of that rating. I couldn't also reliably use my training and experience to fully vet that output, and the AI also wouldn't be able to reliably explain the process it used either. They're pretty famous for not being able to explain how they're doing what they're doing. So, like other things where we don't really know why it works, even if we could establish that it works on a reliable and repeatable way, we'd need to fall back on our science to help create guardrails about when and how we use this so that there's a generalized acceptance in our community about how we do that as a field. And so those who are assessing our tools for reliability and validity can understand the important considerations that they have to take into account, like error rates and things like that. Maybe it's less dangerous for one test result for a test you know well, though we also have to think about things like confirmation bias or other potential confounds if we're going to start changing our workflow in ways that incorporate AI. And that's a very individualized process that's probably going to look different for everyone. One other note here is just that nothing in this section weighs in about disclosure as far as when and how to advise consumers about AI use in some of these ways we're discussing. That is also going to be a highly individualized decision based on your context. Hopefully, these examples help outline why it's important to understand the concept of the black box and how to apply it to decisions for yourself about when and how to use AI responsibly in relation to where our science is playing catch up. Broadly, I'd break this into two categories: practice risks and peripheral risks. And this list is in no way exhaustive. Practice risks are more applied and are things that might land you in a board or malpractice complaint. So, some practice risks include confidentiality mistakes or a breach. So, this would be something like putting an examinee's name into a public version of ChatGPT. Application mistakes or using it improperly without appropriate oversight. So, I think about this as kind of using AI where it shouldn't be used, or by failing to exercise appropriate guardrails, such as overestimating its abilities and trusting it too much, or underestimating its capacity to hallucinate or misunderstand and then not catching that before submitting something, so that these application mistakes lead to an identifiable clinical error. Also, methodological mistakes. So I would include in that the introduction of bias or the interference with sound human decision making. And again, because this is in the applied risk category, what I'm talking about here is when this becomes something that interferes with our sound methodology, how we're actually practicing our work, or how we are or are not adhering to best practices. These would be things that cloud our objectivity in a way that, again, leads to an identifiable clinical error. So contrasted with that would be peripheral risks, and peripheral risks are more existential. And I don't say that to minimize them. I just mean that they're more diffuse and harder to correlate with a short-term or exact outcome. So some peripheral risks include bias. And I mean that in a broader sense, as far as reinforcing societal trends. So remember that AI replicates patterns. So They have, because of that, been shown to reinforce problematic ideas or stereotypes, or to preference certain kinds of trends or ideas that are particularly white or Western or male because they're a reflection of their training data. And they also struggle more to appropriately identify cultural nuance and differences. There are also concerns related to the devaluing of our practice or profession. So, if AI bots start convincingly mimicking what we do as mental health providers, there are fears that we are replacing ourselves. But also in the cheapening idea about what we have to offer, right? So, if a chatbot can do what we do, what does that say about the value of our services? And then there are also what I would call kind of the broader dystopian anxieties and concerns. So many have expressed concern that AI will bring about the demise of humanity. And kind of probably related or at least loosely related to that are concerns about its energy use and consumption. And again, sort of peripherally or related, that it 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 is, or at least has the potential to strip people of their common sense and critical thinking, that it's going to progressively make us dumber and more reliant, and contribute to things like laziness, ultimately and fundamentally changing the world in ways that could be profoundly negative. So these are risks that we want to be holding as we're working with AI so that we can make good decisions on a practice level from case to case, and also to be good humans contributing to pro-social trends. All right, that about wraps up this primer on AI use for psychologists. There are a couple of key takeaways I want to leave you with. Number one, these tools work by being powerful pattern recognition and prediction engines, or LLMs, not by thinking or understanding like humans. Number two, they can be really useful, but only when understood with strategies for risk management across different applications. Number three, we have to understand relevant laws and ethical guidelines, particularly around privacy, informed consent, and use disclosures when we're doing anything with AI. And then lastly, responsibility is squarely on us to check all content always. And that's it. That's about what I have for this AI primer. The only other thing that I'll say is that ongoing education on this topic is really important. So if you can find trainings about AI use in psychological applications, please prioritize attending them. Read articles as fast as they're published, but also consider some less conventional ways of education, like YouTube or podcasts or subscribing to AI newsletters. I'd, of course, be remiss not to mention that APA has some great things they've put out there already, such as a checklist for consideration when using AI tools, and other literature discussing ethical considerations for AI use. And I can link to those below. All right, if this was helpful and you would be so kind as to share it with your colleagues, that would help immensely to get this information out there. And that's something we can all do as a collective community, is to educate each other and to help each other along. If this is a topic that you're interested in, please also consider connecting with me on LinkedIn or through my website so that we can continue the conversation together as we move forward as a field. Thanks so much for listening today. This is Streamline Forensics, and we train forward.